My name is Charlotte. I'm 72 years old. If there is one thing life has taught me, it is this: family comes first. I used to believe that if I was patient enough and loving enough, people would recognize it. I cared for my husband during his illness. I raised my children when we had nothing at all. Later, I supported my grandchildren as well. I cooked and cleaned without ever complaining. I thought family was a given, something constant, but I was mistaken. One day, my son, the boy I devoted my life to raising, said casually, "Mom, you should go live alone in that cabin in the mountains. We cannot live together anymore." In that moment, all the hope inside me withered away. This morning, like every morning, I woke up at 6. While the whole family still slept soundly in their warm rooms, I quietly went down to the kitchen. I put on my thick cardigan and started preparing breakfast for little Benjamin, my grandson. Each day I try to make something he enjoys. Today I made cinnamon roll waffles, something he loved when he was 5. I smiled as I baked. The kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon, melted butter, and a hint of precious family memories. I poured a glass of warm milk, placed it next to the waffles, and went to wake him. Benjamin came down the stairs with his backpack over his shoulder, hair messy, phone glued to his hand. He passed by the table, glanced at the waffles, and frowned. "Grandma, I wanted chocolate donuts." With that said, she opened the refrigerator, took out a box of cereal and some cold milk, completely ignoring the waffles she had just taken from the oven. I said nothing. I quietly placed the waffles in a tin, waiting for another chance. When it was time for school, I grabbed Benjamin's backpack and went to open the car door as usual. But just as I was about to leave with him and walk him to the school entrance, Benjamin turned to me with a gentle voice, sharp enough to pierce right through me. "Grandma, please don't get out of the car. My friends will think you are the maid. It would embarrass me so much." I froze, my hand gripping the door handle tightening. I nodded slightly, smiling. "All right, I understand." He didn't realize he had just given me another quiet rejection. He closed the car door softly, then ran toward the school entrance to join the group of students chatting eagerly. I sat inside the car for several minutes, staring straight ahead. I used to believe that if I were patient enough, loving enough, the children I cared for would appreciate me. But I guess I was wrong. That evening, I prepared dinner, a beef stew with vegetables, a traditional dish that both Jacob and Cynthia loved when times were tough. I cooked it the old-fashioned way, simmering slowly with a splash of red wine to bring out the flavors. The whole family gathered around the table. Charlotte tasted a bite and then pushed the plate aside, her face revealing her displeasure. "Mom, you should use less salt. We eat healthily now. Those old dishes you used to make are just too heavy." Jacob sat next to her without a word. He remained glued to his phone, scrolling through the screen, nodding or frowning occasionally. It was impossible to tell whether it was work or a game. He did not look up when I poured more water into his glass, nor did he pay attention when Cynthia spoke. Benjamin took his seat at the head of the table, eating while watching videos on his iPad, and nobody asked him to put it away. Out of habit, I still placed vegetables on his plate. He pushed them aside without looking, saying, "I already told you I do not like soft carrots." I stayed silent as usual. After dinner, everyone got up and headed straight to the living room. The television was loud as they watched movies, talked, and laughed. I remained in the kitchen, cleaning the dishes, washing the utensils, and wiping the table. The sink water was cold because the water heater was broken. I had mentioned it to Jacob several times, but he said he was busy in the dining room. One thing was still untouched: the chamomile teacup I had prepared for Jacob that afternoon. I knew he liked it. Light, fragrant, good for sleep. I made it as usual and placed it on the table beside his seat, but it was still there waiting. The tea had grown completely cold. I sat down on the wooden kitchen chair without turning on the light or the heater. I simply sat there, alone. From the living room, I could hear laughter, the sounds of an action movie playing on the television, and the clinking of glasses, which used to be the highlight of every meal. Every holiday, every Christmas brought that familiar noise. But now I was the person left in the kitchen, unnoticed and unappreciated. I have lived long enough to recognize certain wounds. They do not require shouting or tears. They just simmer quietly like a forgotten cup of tea on the table. I find myself wondering if I still live with a family or if I have become nothing more than a shadow lingering in their thoughts. I cannot recall exactly when I began living for others, but I know it happened naturally, as if it were the only role assigned to me in life. When I was younger, I was offered the position of head librarian at the Central Library. It was a stable job with a respectable salary, and above all, it was my little dream. I loved books. I adored the silence, and I cherished the feeling of placing each book on the shelf, sensing wisdom gradually filling the room. Yet my husband fell ill. His fragile heart needed someone by his side every single moment. Without hesitation, I declined the job offer. One morning, I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and never opened it again. We moved to the outskirts to be closer to the doctor. I sold all my makeup, including my old favorite motorcycle, to have enough money for my husband's medicine. I never regretted it because at that time I believed a good woman was someone willing to put everything aside for her family. When Jacob went to university, I secretly worked part-time in a small bookstore on the street. Initially, I intended to work only temporarily, but I ended up staying for 4 years. I never told him. I feared he might feel guilty. Every week, I set aside a few $dozen, saving for his extracurricular classes. I clearly remember the feeling each time I saw my paycheck. Just a few simple lines recording my efforts, yet it was more touching than any praise. When Cynthia had a difficult childbirth, I stayed at the hospital for an entire week, changing diapers, giving injections, monitoring the pulse of both mother and child. Jacob was still busy managing contracts. Cynthia was exhausted and the nurses were understaffed. I only slept in brief moments on a plastic chair in the hallway. My back hurt and no one asked if I needed a break. "Mom, you need to rest." I did not demand anything. Honestly, that is how it was. For me, love does not need to be written down. But sometimes silence has its own sound, and the sound I heard was invisibility. There was a time when I wrote down an entire plan to open a small bakery called Charlotte's Oven. My idea was to sell just a few simple items: apple pie, waffles, walnut bread. I did not aim for big profits, only dreaming of having a little place of my own. But then life moved on. Family cooking slowly took the place of that dream. I slipped the notebook under my pillow. Many years passed until my hair turned white. That notebook was still there, with no new notes inside. People often referred to me as a devoted mother, a capable grandmother, a quiet supporter. Yet no one ever called me a strong woman. Perhaps it was because they never saw me as a separate person, only as a background to others' lives. Everything began on a morning that seemed completely ordinary, but ended with a change unnoticed by anyone. That day was Benjamin's 8th birthday. I woke up earlier than usual, and before even washing my face, I started organizing the celebration. Cynthia had told me a few days earlier they were planning an outdoor party, what she called a Hampton-style event. She said exactly those words, then handed me a long list of food, supplies, and tasks. Not a single offer to help, not one question. "Mom, you are tired." It was more like a silent command, assuming I would handle everything as always. I did not say anything. I just nodded and began working, partly out of habit, partly because I had planned to give Benjamin a special present that day. I baked an apple pie following my husband's old recipe. I prepared sandwiches, macaroni and cheese, brownies, fruit salad, and even Southern-style fried chicken, the dish that used to make him jump with joy when he was little. I stayed in the kitchen from the moment the sky was still gray until the sun filled the window panes with light. While I dried my hands and took off the apron to go upstairs and change, I paused near the bag I had packed yesterday. In the main compartment, I placed a brown envelope. Inside was a savings account containing $500,000. It was all the money my husband left before he passed away. I had never used it. I always thought that when the right time came, I would give it to someone who deserved it. Today I was going to give it to my grandson as a way to pass on the love from the previous generation. I stepped into the backyard. The tent was set up and long tables were spread out. Balloons and banners with Benjamin's name in bright metallic letters hung everywhere. At first glance, anyone would think it was a happy day, but I felt lost. I took out the apple pie tray, and before I could put it down, a child, likely one of Benjamin's classmates, pointed and asked, "Who is that old woman?" Benjamin turned around and replied casually, "Oh, she is the housekeeper. She is slow, but does what you tell her." I heard every word clearly. It felt as if someone had poured cold water on me under the blazing sun. The children burst into laughter. A few people at a nearby table glanced at me and nodded knowingly. Seems like a classic maid. She must be reliable to have lasted so long. I stood frozen, still clutching the tray. The butter was still warm. The scent of cinnamon had just spread around. Yet suddenly, everything lost its meaning. Cynthia passed by without a glance, but loud enough for those close to hear. She said, "Mom, if you can't handle it, just say so. We will hire someone to help. Don't let the celebration be delayed." I turned to Jacob, my son, the one I had stayed up all night for, paying tuition, the one I called the greatest achievement of my life. He looked at me, paused for a moment, then bowed his head and softly said, loud enough for me to hear, "Mom, don't mind them. The children are just babbling nonsense." Nobody approached. Nobody took the tray I was holding. I had no strength left to hold it either. The tray slipped from my hand, hitting the stone pavement with a sharp clack. The cake shattered. The warm butter spread out. Everything I had tried to keep inside cracked along with it. No one picked it up. I did not cry. I did not argue. Jacob commanded me, "Mother, go to your room. It's too embarrassing." I turned around and went inside. My legs trembled, but my mind was perfectly clear. When I stepped inside the house, I glanced back at the crowd. Everyone was staring at me and pointing fingers. I went straight to my room, shut the door, and quietly sat on the bed. It took me a few moments to realize that I was still clutching the handle of my bag. I unfastened it and took out the envelope holding my savings account details. I remained like that for a while. No music, no noise, no phone calls. Though the house was crowded, I felt invisible, like a shadow. I opened the envelope and stared at the thin piece of paper I had treasured for so many years. I had imagined giving it as a final gift, sacrificing once again, believing once again. But at that moment, I understood something crucial. Nobody needed what I was offering, not because it lacked worth, but because I was worthless in their eyes. I did not break the savings account. Instead, I folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer. Then I locked it with the rusty key I kept beside my bed. For the first time in ages, I whispered a phrase just for myself to hear. Enough is enough. There was no anger or hatred, only clarity. It was a quiet ending to a way of life I had clung to for far too long. That night, the party carried on. They were still laughing, still snapping photos, still raising glasses while I sat alone in my room filled with doubt. After the celebration, Benjamin knocked on my door early the next morning. I was folding the blankets. Everything in the room looked as neat as ever, except for my mood. He did not speak right away. Instead, he leaned against the door frame for a few moments. Then he spoke quietly, though his hesitation was clear. "Mom, I think you should move to the cabin in the mountains for a while. The air up there is good for your health. You do not feel comfortable here, do you?" I was not surprised. I had been expecting those words from my own son. I looked him straight in the eyes without even bothering to ask again. I simply nodded silently and turned toward the closet. That response felt to me as light as a breath, yet as heavy as the closing of a chapter in my life. Charlotte did not say anything else. He walked away quickly, as if fearing I might change my mind. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hand resting on the drawer where the envelope was kept. I did not need to open it. I just knew I would take it with me, not to give it to anyone, but to start anew. They arranged a small truck to take me and a few belongings to the mountains. No one saw me off. Cynthia was busy at work. Benjamin was still at tutoring. Charlotte only said one sentence before I climbed onto the truck. "Remember to take enough medicine and do not forget to call if you need anything." I smiled but said nothing. I knew I would not call them. I sat at the back of the truck next to some boxes of books, an old fabric suitcase, an armchair, and a basket of pastries I had made myself. The city gradually faded behind me. The wide paved roads, the row houses, and even the local supermarket all passed by the window like a movie that no longer belonged to me. The journey took almost 2 hours. When the truck turned onto the narrow dirt path leading up the mountain, I could smell the scent of dry pine. Dead leaves and cold fog blended together in the air. The small wooden cabin, which used to be our weekend getaway many years ago, now appeared as lonely as a forgotten memory. The driver helped me unload the things. I told him he could leave now. He nodded, saying goodbye with a concerned look, as if he couldn't understand why an elderly woman would choose to live in such a remote place. I closed the door by myself. The cabin was dusty but far from dilapidated. Everything was still there. The wooden table, the wood-burning stove, the old shelves, and the chipped porcelain teacup that I had purchased at a flea market with my husband. I spent the entire afternoon cleaning. Every shelf, each creaky window, every spider web in the corner. Nobody told me to do it. Nobody encouraged me or thanked me. Yet for the first time in many years, I felt free. I made myself a cup of coffee, the kind that was hand-roasted and still kept in a tin can. Sitting in an armchair near the window, I looked out at the pine forest with no sound of cars. No ringing phones, no one calling me Mom just to ask me to wash a cup, clear the table, or do the laundry. It was only me. The first night was colder than I remembered. I lit the wood stove, put on a thick cardigan, and snuggled under the old quilt. In the bedside table drawer, the envelope remained untouched and undisturbed. I did not open it, yet I understood its value. It was the only thing left to me after a life poured out for others. I decided to use it not just to survive, but to truly live again. The next morning, I brewed tea, sliced an apple, and for the first time, wrote again in the worn notebook. The Charlotte oven. Plans to start fresh from this small wooden cabin. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew I would not wait for anyone to call. I would not cling to anyone. I would stop living as if I were merely a faint backdrop in the lives of others. I did not let them go. They had left me long ago. The early days in the cabin felt like being pushed back in time, returning to myself before becoming a wife, a mother, a person shadowed by every meal, holiday, and family picture. I began with small tasks, cleaning the garden, pulling weeds, planting a few lavender bushes near the porch. I rebuilt the old wooden spice rack and scrubbed every glass jar filled with beans, seeds, and flour. Each morning I made coffee and opened the window, allowing the breeze to carry the scent of the damp pine forest inside. I started baking again. At first it was simply from habit. Slowly, simply for the joy of it. The very first batch of apple pie baked in the newly installed wood stove was slightly burnt around the edges, yet aromatic and crisp. I cut a slice and placed it on a chipped porcelain plate. I poured a cup of herbal tea and enjoyed it alone on the steps. No one needed to notice. No comments came forth, too salty, too sweet. Yet to me, it was truly delicious. Honestly delicious. A week later, I took some cinnamon cookies down to the village to buy baking supplies. I wrapped them in plain paper bags without any labels, just a small gift I wanted to share. The girl at the counter watched me as I paid. Her eyes lit up when she saw the cookie bag. "Did you make these?" "Oh my God, they smell like a bakery in Paris I visited while studying abroad." I smiled and said I did it just for fun. Her name was April. She was 30 years old with her hair tied back. She spoke quickly, her eyes bright. She asked questions as if we had known each other for years. "Have you ever opened a bakery?" I shook my head. I had dreamed of it but never took the step. April was silent for a few seconds, then smiled. "Well, you can start now. I run an organic food store online. I want to sell your cookies." I almost laughed. My cookies baked in a little wooden kitchen no one knew about were invited to collaborate. I declined, but she was persistent. 3 days later, he returned to the cabin carrying a mobile Wi-Fi phone and a set of product photography gear. He showed me how to create an Etsy account, how to write product descriptions, and how to reply to customers. "I will handle the online side of things. You just need to focus on baking," he said. I nodded slowly, unsure if I could keep up, but willing to try. During the first month, only a few small orders came in. Every time I received a notification about a new order, my heart would race faster, a feeling I used to have in my youth. I spent all mornings baking to order: banana almond bread, cookies, oatmeal desideratum, and butter-free brownies. I carefully noted every package by hand, writing each recipient's name with purple ink. Around noon, I took the packages to the town post office. One customer left a review after receiving the products. "The cake is soft and fragrant. Eating it feels like being in a kitchen with someone who loves you." I read that sentence over and over again. Later, I printed it out and stuck it on the refrigerator door. That evening, I smiled while baking. A genuine smile without any particular reason. She visited me on Sunday afternoon. We sat on the porch steps, sipping tea and watching sunlight filter through the trees. She said, "You know, I think you should give your bakery a name." I was silent for a moment, then said, "Charlotte's Oven." Charlotte nodded. It sounded warm and deserved. I kept silent afterward, yet deep inside, at that moment, something had thawed. I began to rewrite the old notebook where I used to jot down recipes that never reached anyone else. I added sketches, little notes, even stories that accompanied each cake, not to teach others anymore, but to retell my life through scents, sweetness, and memories as tender as flour and beaten eggs. I once believed I was too old to start anew. I never imagined opening a real bakery at the age of 72. But then a simple sentence from the young woman in the village stayed with me all night. "You bake too. Why not open a small shop? I will help you rent a place. You just need to bake. We will share the work. We will share the joy." I laughed when I heard that while rolling chocolate chip cookie dough balls on the kitchen counter. My hands were slower than in my youth, but still steady. I said I was past the age of starting again. She shook her head firmly and said, "It is not starting over. It is living well, for the first time." I did not answer right away, but that night, sitting alone and drinking tea in the cabin, I opened my savings account for the first time since moving up the mountain. The balance was the same, but its meaning had changed completely. 2 weeks later, April and I drove through the village looking for a place to rent. We chose a small corner next to the bookstore with a wooden porch, old glass windows, and a bell that chimed each time the door was opened. It was not fancy, but inviting. I used a portion of the money I had saved all my life to cover the security deposit. April took care of redesigning the space, building shelves, and creating signs. I wrote the simple menu: apple pie, banana bread, oatmeal cookies, brownies, and one special item each week inspired by whatever caught my imagination. We named the shop Charlotte's Oven, a name that had quietly rested in my notebook for over 30 years. On opening day, I did not invite anyone or advertise, just a handwritten note on the door saying baking was underway from someone who once thought no one needed them anymore. Yet customers arrived, first one, then two, Soon after, a group of middle-aged women came after seeing a post on a small Instagram account created by Hairspray. They tasted the cakes and started asking questions. I shared openly without hiding or embellishing. Just an elderly woman who had been forgotten, learning to live again through baking. Gradually, the shop filled up. Some days I had to wake at 4 a.m. to keep up with baking and serving at the counter. I stayed in the kitchen while we played jazz music and opened the windows, letting the scent of fresh baking drift down the street. Customers used to call me Grandma Charlotte. A widower once told me, "I have never tasted anything that smelled like memories until I tried your cake." Then, one afternoon, while I was tidying up the shelves, I noticed a car stopping outside the shop. I did not pay much attention because I still thought it was a regular customer until he spoke softly and carefully. "Mom, there is someone asking for you. A middle-aged man says he is your son." I froze. My hands were still holding the cloth. The scent of waffles lingered in the air. Jacob walked in. 10 years had passed. Not a single call, not a single letter. And now he was standing there. Not to visit his mother, but because he needed a signature. I invited him to the back kitchen. We sat across from each other at the wooden table I still used every morning to knead dough. He looked around, taking in the shop, the pastry shelves, the delivery boxes, the bills, the order books, the customer reviews, and even the article printed in the local newspaper. Charlotte's Oven, the revival of a mother once forgotten. I saw Jacob's eyes shift slowly from surprise to confusion. Then he said, "Mom, I'm in debt. They are foreclosing the house mortgage. Your name is on it. If you give it up, I can save everything." I did not answer at once. I stood up and pulled an old key from my pocket, the key to the cabin in the mountains. I placed it on the table next to the teacup and told him, "You should go back to the cabin. It holds everything you need to find." That night, Jacob drove up to the mountain. The cabin was still unchanged. The wood stove still bore burn marks. That was where I baked my very first loaf of bread. The bedroom had curtains I had sewn myself. In the nightstand drawer, the savings account book remained, not torn, not missing. Yet there was another piece of paper beside it. I used my money to live, not to chase lost feelings. The house may be gone, but I am still here, and I no longer belong to anyone except myself. Jacob returned to the bakery the next morning. I was arranging pastries on the shelves. She spotted him from a distance as he entered through the kitchen's back door without being invited. It did not surprise me, nor did it shock me. I immediately looked up. Only when he spoke did I turn fully toward him. Jacob's voice was no longer uncertain. It was choked, but filled with bitterness. "Mom, you really don't care anymore. I'm about to lose everything. That house could save everything. Me, Cynthia, even Benjamin. Will you just let me drown? Like this?" I stood up, wiping my hands on my apron, facing him. Sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting his thinner cheekbones and sunken eyes. But he was no longer the child I used to hold in my arms. I asked softly, as if speaking to myself, "What do you think I have been living for the last 10 years? Jacob stayed silent. I kept speaking calmly with no raised voice, though each word carried weight. Like a stone dropped into deep waters. "The day you took me to the mountain, you glanced back. You asked if I was cold, if I had enough medicine, if I needed to call someone. You left me in that cabin as if I were an object no longer useful. And now you come back because I hold something that could save you." Jacob bit his lip, his hands clenched tightly. I continued, "I have spent 10 years alone. No one inquired about me. No one remembered me. But it was there where I found myself again from a pile of flour and an old oven. And you lost me, not just yesterday, but from the moment I became the housekeeper in your family's eyes." Jacob clenched his teeth. "You speak as if you are no longer my mother." I looked straight into his eyes. "I used to be your mother, but I cannot be your shadow forever. I once believed motherhood was constant, but it turns out it has conditions. If people only remember me when they need help. I did not want to keep arguing, so I sent him out of the tent. He stayed outside, shouting inside, "Mother, save me. If they do not help, they will kill me." Do not think running away is all that matters. Everyone passing by is looking inside. It had been a long time since I felt humiliated, but relieved. After many years, he remained silently in the corner all that time. And now, he stepped out. He placed his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You are not cruel. You simply chose to live." 1 week after that meeting, I received a letter from a law office sent by Jacob. The message contained an offer to renegotiate the ownership of the property in a way that would benefit both parties. Below, there was a proposal. If I agreed to give up the donated house, they promised to provide financial support for my care during the final stage of my life. I smiled faintly when I read that part. Care at the end of life. The very people who left me alone on the mountain without a single farewell. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and did not reply. Yet I knew it was time to bring this chapter to a close, officially. I arranged for Jacob to come to the bakery on a calm afternoon. I stepped aside to the storage room. Jacob arrived punctually. His face looked tired, but he still held the confidence of someone used to giving orders. I did not let him speak first. In front of him, I placed a copy of the New Testament I had registered at the town hall. I, Charlotte Mary Walsh, declare that I will not leave any material assets to members of my family who have neglected, abused, or manipulated me from the age of 62 until now. All profits from the Charlotte Bakery after my death will be transferred to an organization offering free vocational training to older women for reintegration into society. Jacob was stunned. His voice became hoarse. "Are you serious?" I nodded calmly without a trace of hesitation, more serious than ever before. She placed her hands firmly on the table, struggling to hold back her emotions. "You are going to erase me from your life forever." I looked him straight in the eyes. "No, you erased me from your life 10 years ago. Today I am only acknowledging that." Jacob stood up. He left without looking back. This time I did not try to stop him. I did not cry. I did not tremble. I did not feel regret. I just sighed, relieved, as if I had shed an old layer of skin that I had worn my entire life. That night, I sat in the kitchen, opening an old photo album. There was a picture of Jacob as a child standing next to his first bike, his mouth full of eager anticipation. Another photograph showed my husband hugging me from behind in the garden, and a more recent one captured April and me, smiling together at the bakery, hands covered in flour, hair messy. I folded them gently and placed them in a separate envelope labeled Charlotte, representing my own chapter in life. I'm no longer the mother of someone who does not see me as a person. I no longer act as a wife or serve as a supporter. I am not a mental crutch for those who only remember me when they fall. For the first time in 72 years, I am truly free. Since that last encounter with Jacob, it feels as though an invisible cord in my heart has been severed, not with knives or scissors, but with clarity. Yet there is no pain, no anger, no need to explain. It simply ended. And after parting from an old life, I began to truly live for the rest of my days. Charlotte's bakery has become busier by the day. She is young, imaginative, and constantly introduces fresh ideas, while I am the one working in the kitchen, preserving the warmth of pastries that carry the scent of cherished memories. Together, we form a perfectly balanced team. Every morning I still wake up early, but it is different from before. I no longer get up to serve others, but to welcome the happiness I create. Lighting the stove, kneading the dough, adding cinnamon, incorporating butter. I feel myself coming back to life. These are the same hands that used to be called slow and useless. Regular customers affectionately call me the Charlotte of the Village. A group of middle-aged women started a club named One Dish Per Week, following my recipe. They learn how to bake cakes and also how to speak kindly to themselves. I began offering baking classes every Saturday afternoon. My students come from all walks of life. One woman, aged 80, wants to make a wedding cake for her granddaughter. A single mother who just lost her job joins in, and a boy struggling with depression after his parents' divorce also attends. One day after class, a woman told me, "You do not just teach me to bake cakes, you teach me to be patient with myself." I'm not sure if that was true, but I feel glad I did not remain silent forever. By the end of that spring, I was invited to share my story during a community talk called Second Bloom, which celebrates flowers that bloom late. I stood on a small stage in the library, ready to speak. In front of about 60 people from the village, my hands were shaking as I held the microphone, but my voice remained steady. I shared the story of being left alone on the mountain, about the wooden cabin, the old stove, and the very first time I dared to live solely for myself. At the end of my speech, a long applause erupted. A woman shed tears. A young man bowed and thanked me. I never believed that an elderly woman kicked out of her home by her children could inspire anyone. Yet it turns out that simply standing up and continuing to live is enough for someone to live courageously. Since then, I write blogs, share recipes, and tell stories. I invested the first earnings from the bakery into working with Apple and establishing a starter fund to support older women who want to learn baking and start over. The first 3 women have joined. One used to be a housekeeper, dismissed for not being fashionable enough. Another once lived in a shelter. When I see their images, I recognize parts of myself in them and offer help not because I pity them, but because I understand the chill that comes from no one calling your name lovingly. That night, after a long day of work, I sat on the porch holding a cup of ginger tea, gazing at the faint stars against the dark sky. There is no mother calling from the house anymore. No little hand hugs me when I come home late. But I do not feel lacking. My life is full, with a warm bakery that I have built, true friends and genuine respect, something I believed I had to struggle for throughout my life. No, I am not old. I simply blossomed recently. Late, but still in time. Autumn has arrived in the town. The maple tree in front of the bakery is beginning to shift its color. Every morning, while sweeping leaves, I watch time pass slowly, relentlessly. It neither holds anyone back nor waits for anyone. Just like me, the bakery remains busy. Apple has just signed a deal to supply bread to a cafe in the city. I no longer take part much in management. These days, I do less, teach more, and write more. A small publishing house contacted me, interested in releasing the book Healing Recipes, blending memories and food. I never imagined someone one day would ask, "Do you have a portrait for the cover?" I smiled. A portrait of someone who lived a whole life without their own face. Then one afternoon, as I was cleaning the counter, I noticed a figure standing on the other side of the street looking inside the shop. I recognized him immediately. Although many years had passed, Jacob looked very different. Thin, hair streaked with silver, a gaunt face like someone who had weathered a storm without shelter. He stayed there for a long time, then slowly entered. April had just seen him and was about to leave, but I gently shook my head. Let him in. Jacob stood in front of the bakery counter staring at the trays of brownies, cookies. Then, raising her eyes to meet mine, she asked calmly first, "Ginger tea as usual." She nodded, taking a seat by the window. The atmosphere between us was silent, thick and heavy like rain that had not yet fallen. I brought out a cup of tea, the same tea I had prepared for her for so many years. Yet I had never seen her drink it all at once. This time she held it with both hands. She took a deep breath. Then Mom spoke. "I am sorry." I said nothing. I just stared straight into her eyes, something I had not dared to do for so long, back when I was still a shadow in the kitchen. I was wrong. I know. Mom was there, but I stayed silent. Mom was calm. Yet I turned my back to her when I looked away. Mom was no longer Mom, at least not the one I knew. I placed my hand on the still warm cup of tea. "It is not right, Jacob. I am still your mom. It is just that you have never truly seen who I am." She lowered her head with her shoulders shaking slightly. "I did not come to ask for money, not this time. Just, I do not know if I still have the right to call you Mom." I remained quiet. Inside, there was no anger left, no resentment either. Everything that once burned me had now cooled, not because it had gone out, but because it had learned to transform into something else. I answered with a firm voice. "I do not need you to call me anything, Jacob. I just hope that if you ever have children, you quietly leave your life behind. You will remember the woman sitting right in front of you." Jacob did not say a word. After a while, he took a notebook out of his bag. My notebook, the old recipe book I had left behind in the cabin 10 years ago. I kept it after you gave me the cabin key. I went upstairs and found it. At that moment, for the first time in my life, I understood that once you had a dream. He handed me the notebook, but I did not take it. "Keep it." That is the part of me that lived in silence. Now it is your turn to learn how to listen to it. We sat for a little longer. The tea was getting cold. The cake was not warm anymore either. Jacob stood up, but before leaving, he asked, "Will you ever forgive me?" I answered very softly, "I do not carry hatred, Jacob, but neither do I carry my old role. I forgive you. Not so you could find peace, but so I would no longer have to hold on to something unworthy." He nodded. He leaned forward, for the first time in a long while, looking at me as a person, not an invisible source of service. After Jacob left, he came back from the store. He did not ask anything. He simply placed a box of cake on my table. It was the first batch of cake he and I had ever made together in the shop. I opened the lid. The warm scent of butter, vanilla, and a hint of cardamom filled the air. April spoke softly. "Maybe I will not come back." I nodded. "And you do not need me to come back either, do you?" I replied. "That is right. Now I only need myself." That night I walked home alone. The early autumn breeze gently swept through my hair. My skin was slightly wrinkled, yet no longer as stiff as it once had been. In my mind, there were no disputes, no guilt, no knocking on doors without permission. Only the sound of my footsteps on the dirt path, the whisper of the forest wind, and the steady beating of my heart. I brewed some tea and switched on the porch light. I leafed through another blank recipe notebook, fresh and empty on the first page. I wrote nothing. It was too late. If I am still breathing today, 2 months after the last meeting with Jacob, it feels like a gift. I received an email from the organization called Second Bloom, inviting me to share the story of my life. They wanted me to take part in a special exhibition for women older than 60. Each participant was to bring an object that tells a story, something symbolizing a turning point in their life. I pondered over it for days, not because I lacked something to bring, but because I wanted to choose something deeply meaningful. I glanced around the small kitchen, behind the shop, the old flower shelf, the first oven, the apron I had worn during those early years of starting anew. But then I stopped at something very simple, a heart-shaped cookie cutter with a chipped edge. That was the cookie cutter I had brought from the cabin years ago. It was tied to the first batch of cake I had ever baked, with a burned edge reminding me of new beginnings and imperfect journeys. Yet I still ate it all, Not because it tasted amazing, but because it was the very first cake I had ever baked for anyone other than myself. The exhibition happened on a Friday afternoon in a large library nestled in a small town beyond the mountains. I wore a long cream-colored sweater dress, a wool scarf knitted by my own hands, no makeup, no high heels. But for the very first time, I felt beautiful, a kind of beauty that needed no approval or display. It was simple. The cookie cutter placed inside a glass box with a handwritten note underneath. I had lived my entire life as a mother, a wife, a shadow behind others. But the first cookie made with this cutter was also the first time I baked out of love for myself. That was when I realized I deserved a life that didn't need anyone's validation. Many people stopped and stayed for a long time. Some asked to take photographs. Others cried. Some placed their hands on the glass as if trying to touch something deeply personal and real. I simply stood behind, holding a cup of tea, smiling. I did not need to step forward into the crowd or seek to shine. I only needed to be seen for the very first time under my true name. That night I stayed in town with him, in a small and cozy Airbnb apartment. She brought wine, we played jazz music and baked together, not for guests, but for ourselves. We baked and laughed about trivial things. Clients who request the wrong things. A young woman who adores brownies but is allergic to butter. Or the first time I tried to open TikTok and accidentally broadcasted live while brushing my hair. April looked at me, clinked her glass, and said, "I do not know who you were before, but now you are one of the strongest women I have ever met." I looked at her. I choked a little. Then I nodded, replying softly. I did not know who I was either until I began to live without waiting for anyone to guide me. 1 week after the exhibition, I received an invitation from a university in a neighboring state to speak at an orientation session for social work students. The topic was caring for the elderly, listening before losing the chance. I accepted not because I wanted to share my sad story, but because I knew that if a young student heard part of my truth, who knows? Maybe in the future, a mother like me would not be pushed to a mountain again. I also started planning to travel. The first trip was to Savannah, a place I dreamed of when I was 20 years old. Before meeting my husband, I booked the plane ticket. I chose the hotel on my own. I wrote in my notebook, "Charlotte, let your feet lead you." For the first time in more than 40 years, I did not need to ask anyone's schedule. I did not have to ask for permission. I did not need to plan anyone else's meals. I was like a truly free woman, the average. A new notebook with a light brown cover. The corner was engraved with the words, "You are not late. You were simply waiting for yourself." I had almost filled the entire notebook with thoughts about new recipes, intriguing customers, the class I was teaching, and an elderly man who visited the bakery every Wednesday afternoon only to buy a slice of apple pie and share an old story about my smile each time I cleaned the pastry counter in the morning, and about the silence, which no longer felt lonely but calm. I do not know how far I will go. I no longer dwell on the what-ifs or could-have-beens. But if I could send a brief message to the woman from 10 years ago standing alone in the wooden cabin in the mountains, I would say, "I wish you had dared sooner, but it is all right, because now you have dared." And if someone is reading these lines and feels stuck in a cold kitchen, invisible like a shadow, remember that you can still escape. Whether you are 35 or 72 years old, you only need to dare to choose yourself once. I used to believe that if I were good enough, sacrificed enough, and was patient enough, someday people would recognize my worth. I thought being a mother, a wife, or someone behind the scenes was an honor, no matter how quietly I did it. I told myself, just try a little harder because that is family and family is forever. But then I came to understand a hard yet essential truth. Not everyone truly knows how to love, and not everyone deserves your sacrifices. My story is not about revenge. It is not about reclaiming a home or punishing anyone. It is the journey of a woman who once lost herself and later decided to rise again, without waiting for anyone to lift her up, without blaming anyone for her fall. I am not anyone's victim. I was simply someone who never had the courage to choose herself. The most important lesson I learned after all those years is this: you do not need permission to live for yourself. You should not wait for someone else to recognize you in order to see yourself as worthy. You do not have to be young again to begin anew. All you need is to start right where you are standing. Once you dare to leave behind your old role, whether it be a shadow or a forgotten name at the dinner table, you will realize that this very courage is the greatest love you can give yourself. If anyone is reading these words and finds themselves in this story, the woman washing dishes in the quiet kitchen, the mother treated like a housekeeper, the grandmother kept away from her grandchild's birthday, the one she used to sing to every night, I want to tell you that you are not wrong. You are not small. You are not invisible. You are simply waiting for the right moment to choose yourself. And if you have not done it yet, start today. Even if it feels late, there is still time. I am Charlotte, and I used to live my entire life for others. However, starting at 72 years old, I began to live for myself. That has become the most wonderful chapter of my life.